The full meaning of my mother's death had settled over me before they lowered her into the grave. They buried her at 2:30 in the afternoon. Now, at nightfall, our big family was starting to break up. Once there had been 15 of us, and at 16, I was the youngest. There was never much money, so now my older brothers and sisters were scraping up enough for my coach ticket north. I would live in St. Paul, Minnesota with my sister Maggie, as my mother had requested a few minutes before she died. I would miss this Kansas land that I was leaving. Yet, as the train sped along, the telegraph poles whizzing toward and past us, I had a feeling that I was escaping a doom which had already trapped the relatives and friends I was leaving behind. For although I was departing from this beautiful land, it would be impossible ever to forget the fear, the hatred, and violence that Negroes had suffered upon it. It was all behind me now. By the next day, there would be what my mother had called another kind of world, one with more hope and promising things. She had said, "Make a man of yourself up there. Put something into it, and you'll get something out of it." It was her dream for me. When I stepped onto the chilly streets of St. Paul, Minnesota 2 days later, I was determined to fulfill that dream. I had never met my brother-in-law, and his handshake told me that I was to be tolerated rather than accepted. He was nearly white, big and fierce-looking. He seemed formidable. His only words to me that first evening were about things I should not do in his house. I enrolled in Mechanic Arts High School and got an evening job bussing dishes in a diner where I was paid $6 a week and given 1 meal a day. My brother-in-law took 2 of this for my rent and meals. Yet the $4 he left me seemed adequate. It was more than I had ever had at one time in my entire life. The new friends I made kidded me about my country mannerisms and dress, my shyness with the girls, and my Kansas talk. But when basketball season came, my status grew. The regulation hoops seemed a lot wider than the small barrel rims to which I had learned to shoot, and they were impressed when the ball swished through, hardly ever touching the rim. Not long after this, they invited me into the Diplomats Club. Their team needed a good forward, and they liked my way of playing. My sister was much happier than my brother-in-law about all this. He should spend his extra time making a better living, he grumbled. Real winter came one Friday just before Christmas. A hungry north wind knifed down like a hawk. By 7 o'clock that night, the temperature had dipped to 10 degrees below zero. It was the night our club was to make arrangements for its Christmas party. I was bundled up to go to the meeting. Maggie Lee, her friend Crystal Graham, and my brother-in-law were sitting in the living room as I said good night and started out. "Where you going, boy?" My brother-in-law's voice was menacing. "To a club meeting." "You ain't going no place. You were out 2 nights in a row." I got hot beneath my clothes. Crystal cleared her throat nervously, and Magalee's eyes darted back and forth between her husband and me. "It's our last meeting before the party." My tone was guarded to avoid trouble, if only for my sister's sake. "You heard me," he said, rising from his chair. "Gordon? Gordon?" My sister was up between us. Crystal was behind her. Now, perhaps if he hadn't shoved my sister against the wall, I might have gone back to my room. But when that happened, I rushed toward him, swinging for his belly before he realized what was happening. But he was a powerful man. My blows only angered him. He pounced on me, crushing me to the floor beneath his 230 pounds. His hands were groping for my throat. And while my sister and Crystal screamed at the top of their lungs, he began choking me and banging my head against the floor. "Stop it! You're killing him! Stop it!" Now Crystal was beating his head with an umbrella. His hands fell loose, and I scrambled from beneath him, and as she continued to beat him, I rolled across the floor and ran out the door. Crystal grabbed her coat and followed me out. I had been thrown out so quickly, it was difficult to grasp the truth of it. But after 2 blocks, the cold and the empty street told me that for the first time I was homeless and alone. Only a few months before, my family and home had seemed to be something which would last forever. I remembered our pot-bellied stove, heated to redness, pans of chicken, cornbread, rolls, pudding, and pies, my brothers and sisters eating at the oversized supper table. Now, as the stale heat of Jim Williams' pool hall hit my face, the sense of being and belonging seemed of another life, another time. My hands and feet were stiff. I dropped my belongings, pressed against the radiator, and blew on my fingers to kill the numbness. I only had $2.50 left from my paycheck. My brother-in-law had taken the rest. I anticipated the warmth of school the following week, then remembered it was already closed for the holidays. The diner where I worked would be shut until Monday. And with a lump in my throat, my chest heaving, my stomach in knots, I watched the pool players drifting around and above the green of the billiard tables, but their hawking, spitting, cursing, and laughter seemed detached from them. They were like ghosts. For several weeks at night, I rode trolley cars back and forth to the end of the line between St. Paul and Minneapolis. The rent was reasonable. There was always some heat. My food for those days and nights was the single meal I got at the diner, eked out by hot dogs and root beer. Now I became fully aware of the problems that I faced, and quickly enough I tried thinking of ways to survive. The distance back to Kansas was insuperable. I never thought of seeking shelter and food at the Salvation Army or some other charity. Yet there were some other things I did consider. The worst was robbery. This I came closest to one dawn when I found myself alone on the trolley with an aging conductor. It was my birthday, and we were back in St. Paul. The trolley operator had already gone for coffee to a cafe across the street. The conductor poked me awake, saying that we were at the end of the line. He stood there just above me, with a bundle of green bills wadded together with a rubber band. At the sight of them, my hand tightened about a switchblade in my pocket. I rose slowly, looking through the windows to see who was about. We were alone. His back was toward me as he walked to the rear of the car. Perspiration rolled down my armpits, and the anxiety of evildoing must have shown on my face. I pressed the button, and the long blade popped out. "Conductor!" "Yes?" He turned and looked calmly at the blade. I looked at him, trembling now, with all my mother's teaching coming hot at me. "Conductor," I said, "would you give me $1 for this knife? I'm hungry, and I don't have any place to stay." He watched me for a second. "You can keep the knife," he said. "Come on over to the cafe and I'll buy you a meal." I stood shaking for a moment, not knowing just what to do. Then I closed the blade. "I'm sorry," I said. "Oh, it's all right," he answered, and he peeled off $2 bills. "Go where you want and get some grub." "It's okay, I can manage." "Take it," he insisted, "and keep yourself out of trouble." I refused the money, jumped out of the car, and hurried off, more frightened and ashamed than I'd ever been in my life. The pool room would be opening soon, and it would be warm there. Several things happened that spring which would brighten the coming summer. 3 older sisters, Lillian, Gladys, Cora, a brother Jack, and later my father came to live in St. Paul. I got a job as a bellboy evenings after school at the Minnesota Club, and I fell in love with Sally Alvis. The world inside the Minnesota Club was one of spacious rooms with high-beamed ceilings, of thick carpeting, of master and servant, of expensive wines and liquors, of elegant table settings. Influential men like Frank Kellogg, Justice Pierce Butler, and Jim Hill of the Great Northern Railway sat about smoking long cigars and ornate pipes in the overstuffed high-backed chairs of the mahogany-paneled library. And I, dressed in a suit of blue tails, white tie, and striped red vest, would stand near them, discreetly listening to their confidential talk of financial deals, court decisions, their wives and their children, boats, politics, women, the stock exchange, and the weather. To most of them, I was invisible and unhearing, a sort of dark ectoplasm that only materialized when their fingers snapped for service. But there was a lot an unlettered black boy from Kansas could learn here. And what I learned, I took deep inside, determined meanwhile to put each lesson into use whenever I could. I began to read more, slipping newspapers, novels, and books of poetry from the library. And soon a whole new world was opening up, one that would have been impossible to imagine back in Kansas. That summer I met Sally. She had a dimpled smile on her pale beige face when a classmate introduced us. I smiled back and said that I was very glad to meet her. She had soft black hair that swept back into a knot at the nape of her neck. Her dress was powder blue silk. We sat there, not knowing how to say good night. When the front door of her house opened, she said, "It's Mom. I'll have to go now." She pressed my hand gently, quickly, got out, and ran up the steps. And from that moment on, I was in love. On the 15th of October, I asked Sally if she would marry me. She only blushed, laughed, and explained, "Why, I must finish high school before thinking about such things." I felt a little crushed, but she hadn't refused outright. Furthermore, common sense warned me to finish high school, too, before taking on a wife. I opened a savings account, anticipating the day, a year later, when we both could graduate. The employees' locker room at the Minnesota Club was unusually quiet when I arrived at work one Wednesday morning that same month. Waiters who had known each other for years were sitting about as though they were strangers. The cause for silence was tacked to the bulletin board. It read, "Because of unforeseen circumstances, some personnel will be laid off for the 1st of next month. Those directly affected will be notified in due time." It was signed, "The Management." "President Hoover's ruining the country," an old waiter finally said. No one answered him. I changed into my suit of blue tails, wondering just what had happened. By Thursday, the entire world knew. "Market crashes, panic hits nation," one headline blared. The newspapers were full of it, and I read everything I could get my hands on, gathering in the full meaning of such terms as Black Thursday, deflation, and depression. I couldn't imagine such financial disasters touching my small world. It surely concerned only the rich. But by the 1st of November, I too knew differently. Along with the millions of others across the nation, I was without a job. All that next week, I searched for any kind of work that would prevent my leaving school. Again, it was, "We're firing, not hiring." "Sorry, Sonny, nothing doing here." Finally, on the 7th of November, I went to school and cleaned out my locker, knowing it was impossible to stay on. The new year rang in more snow and icy wind. During the last week in January, I decided, for some inexplicable reason, to try my luck in Chicago. That same weekend, I met a trumpet player named Jess Turner. Soft-spoken, tall, and consumptive-looking, he was stranded with an orchestra and wanted to get back to Chicago to his wife and children. We were standing by my favorite radiator in Jim Williams' pool hall, trying to think of some way to make the trip, knowing neither of us had the necessary cash. It was Jess who finally brought up the idea of hopping a freight. The weather was well below zero, and I pulled on 3 layers of long underwear, 2 pairs of wool socks, and overshoes. Jess's landlady had held his clothing for unpaid rent, and he was poorly dressed for such weather in a Chesterfield overcoat, a thin suit, and patent leather shoes. He had no gloves and carried only his trumpet case. I was concerned for him and told him so, but the cold, tight-fisted ways of Minnesota had numbed him into an almost suicidal indifference. He seemed to ignore the unmercifully cold winds that pushed us along after we reached the freight yard. Hour by freezing hour, we rattled over the countryside, and only the quiet of my mind, braced against the noise and the incredible cold, assured me of reality. All the problems of the world seemed to be contracted into small and impersonal space. Jess, I, and a hobo named Joe were the three shivering strangers, sharing our gloom in terms of chance and hard times. The trouble came the next morning when we decided to stand for a stretch. Joe and I got to our feet, but Jess could only move from his waist up. He kept pinching his legs and thighs, saying he felt like a rock. We pulled him up to his feet, but he began to totter. We tried to make him take a step, but he couldn't move. Joe felt his lower limbs. "This ain't good," he said. "This ain't good. Your friend's got a bad frostbite. Better lay him back down." The morning seemed endless. I thought of Sally and the uncertain hours stretching ahead. Depressed and disillusioned, I had left without seeing her. It was only a hastily scribbled note, mailed, saying that I would be out of town for a few weeks. I could give no address, but I would write. I promised. We reached the Chicago freight yards early the next morning. A sparse scattering of snow whitened the area, but it was nothing like Minnesota. After the train had stopped, I jumped out and ran across to a signal tower for help. The man inside listened to my story rather unsympathetically. Then he said he had work to do and couldn't be bothered with the frozen bums. But I persisted until he telephoned the yard master. In about an hour, they brought an ambulance to the edge of the tracks and brought out a stretcher to take Jess away. That night, I found a flop house on Lower Wabash Avenue called the Hotel Southland. Rooms were advertised for 25 cents and up. The $2 I had would provide 8 nights of shelter. A young clerk with a badly pimpled face was on the desk. He eyed me curiously and in a very nervous voice asked me what I wanted. "A 25-cent room," I answered. He looked at me as though I were about to draw a gun on him. "I'm not supposed to take colored in here. I'm sorry. It's the boss's rule, not mine. You understand, don't you?" "No, I don't understand. It's damn cold out there, and I got a quarter to pay for a bed." I glanced about the dirty, smoke-filled lobby, at the despondent, broken men sitting and lying about on the floor. "Oh, well, why don't you try the colored section out on the south side of town?" "Because I want work downtown here, and I don't have a car fare back and forth." "You looking for work?" "Just a minute. Maybe I can do something for you." He disappeared behind a ragged velvet drapery into an inner room. After a few minutes, he reappeared with a tall, fat man named John. John chewed on a cigar butt and tobacco juice coursed down his bulbous chin. "Mike tells me you're looking for a room and work. Is that so?" "That's right." "You look like a clean-cut colored boy." "I'm a boy. I don't know what my color's got to do with it." "Now, don't go getting your dander up. I think I got a proposition for you." I waited. "How'd you like to have a room and a job both?" "Where?" "Right here. I'm needing a boy to clean this place. You'll get a room in the back and $1 a day." 50 cents a day would hardly keep me in food. And a back room in a flop house would be pretty bad, I thought. "Why don't you take it?" Mike urged. "At least you'll be out of the cold and have a place to sleep." "I'd like to know why I just can't pay and sleep here." "Look, I ain't no expert on race problems," the fat man said impatiently. "I'm just giving you a proposition. Why don't you try it to see how things work out? Give me 25 cents more a day and some food." "Hell, fella, you'll be making $1 a day with all that. That's big dough around these parts." "Sorry," I said, turning as if I were going. "Okay, I'll try it your way. 6 bits a day and some grub." He threw up his hands and went back through the curtain. "This joint's dirty as hell. It ain't been swept for a week," Mike whispered. He led me through the tangle of ill-smelling men and up to a tiny, unheated room on the 3rd floor. When John awakened me at 7 the next morning, an awful stench was in the place. After a breakfast of an oily, nondescript soup and stale bread, I went up to clean the rooms and the toilets. and I instantly learned that poverty in the big cities festered a special kind of filth. Some of the men were up and moving about. Others still slept. Several of them had ignored the toilets and defecated upon the floor. One drunk lay face down in his own vomit, and another, claiming to have been beaten and robbed during the night, lay groaning in his bed, his blanket matted with blood. The toilets were filthy beyond use. Our hog pens back in Kansas were antiseptic by comparison. Without doubt, the Hotel Southland was the vilest piece of real estate in the entire city of Chicago. One morning I woke to a commotion down on the second floor. When I moved to the staircase to look down, a man ran up and passed me toward my room. Several policemen were running about brandishing their guns. They had subdued two men, who laid handcuffed on the floor, and were searching for the one who had run past me. The men, I found out later, had been involved in the holdup. Big John was with the police, helping to search the cages, and after a few seconds they stormed up toward me. "Anybody come up this way, boy?" I pointed in the direction the man had gone, realizing that he was hiding either in the toilet or in my room. They found him under my bed. They pulled him out, and beat him, and dragged him downstairs. 3 days later, I found a pistol beneath my bed. The hold-up man had obviously left it there. I knew I should have returned it, but there was something appealing about having a gun in this place. I knew it could be a protection against the place itself. The trouble came on Saturday when I went down to collect my pay from Big John. As on every Saturday, he was drunk, and Mike was there, and a couple of drunks were stretched out on the floor. They had their backs propped up against the wall. "Get out of here, you black bastard. Can't you see I'm busy?" He doubled up his fist as if he was going to hit me. Everything blurred, and my body shook with a rage. I knew I should have backed away, but my temper was out of control, and I foolishly challenged him. "Give me my money, you lousy dog. I'm quitting." He charged me like a bull, pummeled my face and body, slammed into the wall, and kneed me to the floor. Pain streaked through my groin, but I managed to slide from beneath his kicking and scrambled out the door. "You black son of a bitch, you won't get a cent now. Turn in your lock and get the hell out of here before I kill you." Kill you, kill you, kill you. That thought burned into my mind all the way up the steps. My lip was cut, my nose was bleeding, and my groin felt as if it were on fire. I ran cold water over my wrists and arms and head, and though the bleeding stopped, my anger continued to rise. I had saved $16, and that was in my money belt, which I had sewn together. When I lifted the mattress to retrieve it, I saw the gun. I buckled the belt around my waist and shoved the gun into my overcoat pocket. Mike was at the outer desk when I reached the office. "You better get out fast," he warned me. "John's half crazy. Come back tomorrow. He'll forget all about it." I pulled out the pistol and pointed it straight at Mike from a low angle. "I won't come back tomorrow, and I won't forget what he did to me in there. Now you get in there and get my money out of his drawer right now and make it snappy." Big John was seated now, and he began shaking when he saw the gun pointing at his heart. I don't know whether he shook from rage or from fear. "Give me that gun, boy," he growled. "I'll take it away from you. You try and see what happens." The two drunks lay unmoving on the floor as if nothing unusual were happening. "Go ahead, Mike. Get my money out of that drawer." He looked appealingly to Big John, who grudgingly nodded his consent. And Mike, in his nervousness, gave me an extra $1. I put it in my pocket, and Big John sat smoldering, his hand inching toward the whiskey bottle on his desk. But I snatched it from his reach, and I emptied the contents into a glass and splashed it into his face, blinding him momentarily. He tried to rise, but I knocked him sideways with the butt of the pistol. He tried to get up again, but I swung viciously, and I caught him on the temple, and he collapsed in a heap on the floor. I ran from the building and kept running toward the Union Station, expecting any minute to hear a police siren, but none sounded. Halfway across the river bridge, I slowed down and looked in all directions. No one was watching. I pitched the gun sideways into the water, and I hurried on out to the station. Inside, I pulled the coat up around my neck to hide the bloody shirt and went to the washroom. "Gordon?" The voice was frightening, yet it was somehow familiar and friendly, and I turned toward it, filled with apprehension. "Uncle Pete," I said in a half-cry. "My God, boy, what's happened to you?" He was dressed in a Pullman porter's uniform, ready to make his run back to St. Paul and then on to Seattle. "What's all that blood done on your shirt like that?" "I gotta get out of here, Uncle Pete. I'm in serious trouble. Button up and come with me. You can tell me the rest later." He took me up to his Pullman car, put me into an empty compartment, and went out to receive his passengers. It was like an eternity before the conductor hollered, "All aboard!" Then at last the train was rolling, and a feeling of safety grew with every click of the train's wheels as I relaxed in the comfort of that plush compartment. "You're lucky to be alive, boy," Uncle Pete said after I had eaten and spilled out my story. He made down a bed for me, and I washed, changed, and crawled into the clean softness of it, thinking that I would like to lie there forever. In minutes, I was deep in a dreamless sleep. July brought my first quarrel with Sally. It happened over some minor thing, but it kept us apart for months. And during those hours, I worried and worked at a composition that spoke my feelings. It was a song called No Love, and I wrote it at an upright piano my sister inherited with the house. And now that I had started writing songs again, I worked at it late into the nights and on weekends. Music was the one thing that kept me hopeful. Many of the best orchestras played at the large Twin City hotels. If only I could get one of them to broadcast my songs, I thought. Well, this thought grew, and I hurried home. I sorted out several of my compositions and set my alarm clock for 6 o'clock. And by 7:30 the next morning, I was at the Hotel St. Paul servants' entrance, with the songs tucked in my pocket, applying for a waiter's job. "Are you an experienced waiter?" "Oh, yes, sir, yes, sir." I had never waited on a table in my life. "You ever worked here before?" "Not yet." "No, sir, I never worked here before." "Well, where have you worked?" "Oh, the Minnesota Club, the Laurie Hotel, the—" Okay. There's a Rotary luncheon here today. Nothing steady. You want to work it?" "Is that where the orchestra plays?" "Orchestra? What's the orchestra got to do with it?" he asked. "Oh, nothing. Just thought I'd ask." My heart thumped like a drum. "Well, do you want it or not?" he snapped. "Oh, yes, sir, I'll take it." I stepped up to his table and signed in. Well, now the banquet captain changed my status from waiter to busboy the instant he saw me pick up a tray. And as I trudged back and forth between the kitchen and the banquet hall under the weight of the trays of drinks, I could hear the music coming from the main dining room. It was frustrating to have Glenn Gray so close and not to be able to talk with him. But the driving captain kept his eye on me, pointing to the tray after tray. And only once, when the dining room door swung open, did I glimpse the tall, debonair orchestra leader directing his orchestra. Glenn Gray left soon after, without my having had a chance to speak to him, but Kay Kaiser, Bert Lown, Jack Teagard, and others who came later didn't get off so easy. Each of them suffered through my inexhaustible efforts, and they encouraged me. Late that summer, I was offered the head busboy job at the Hotel Lowry by the maitre d'hotel. He was a former wrestler whose name was Gleason. I took it, and for nearly 3 hours each day after the luncheon crowd left, I had the main dining room and the huge grand piano all to myself. Once the tables were set for the evening, I played away before an imagined audience, using the light control switches for color combinations that added to the mood. On one such afternoon, I was playing and singing No Love when I felt someone was behind me. Embarrassed, I stopped and turned and looked into the shadows. It was Larry Duncan, the orchestra leader who was currently engaged by the hotel. "Is that your music?" he asked. "Yes." Go ahead, play it again." I played it again, and he listened attentively. When I finished, he asked me if I would like to have it orchestrated. I sure would, I said. It was probably the understatement of my lifetime. The orchestra's arranger spent the rest of that afternoon with me, taking the piece down as I played it. And as I watched him work, I hoped that my afternoons of fantasy were coming to an end. Now, this happened on a Wednesday. During dinner on the following Friday night, Larry motioned me toward the bandstand. "Gordon, we're broadcasting No Love on the network show tomorrow night. With your permission, of course," he said, smiling. Well, I got Sally on the telephone without knowing whether she cared or not. I excitedly spilled out the good news. "I composed it for you. Don't forget to listen." Her voice didn't reveal the slightest interest. She said very casually that she would listen. But I found out later, she spent the rest of that evening and the next day drifting about in a trance. On the night of the broadcast, Abby the drummer congratulated me and showed a group of waiters and myself the program. Fate had arranged things. There was my name among those of Irving Berlin, Duke Ellington, Cole Porter, and Jerome Kern. Now, in spite of my imagining the worst, a broken microphone, a broken promise, a canceled broadcast, it at last was going to happen. I knew that Gleason kept a death watch on unfilled water glasses, so I went about filling them to the brim. I wanted to hear every word, every note, without being disturbed. When at last the moment came, people continued to eat, drink, and talk as if they were unaware of the miracle taking place. I wanted to shout, to command everyone to listen, to ascend with me far above ordinary things. But they kept on eating, drinking, laughing, and talking. And just before the vocalist approached the microphone, I took refuge near the bandstand where I could hear him sing my lyrics. But now, and at such a moment, a drunk started rapping his glass with a spoon. He wanted more water. I ignored him. He rapped louder, and I hated him for it. "What is it, sir?" A shiver went up my back. It was Gleason's voice. "Water, water! Tell that damn boy our party wants water." Such was my lot, I thought, and I turned toward the table only to have Gleason wave me away. He was filling the glasses himself and proudly explaining that the music the orchestra was playing was mine. The drunk whispered the news to his party, and his party whispered the news to the next table, and soon everyone in the entire dining room was looking toward me. When the orchestra finished, a burst of applause filled the air. I smiled nervously, picked up a tray of dirty glasses, and left the room amidst the ovation. Then, slipping into an empty room, I telephoned Sally. "Yes, I listened," she said, "and it was beautiful, just beautiful. Would you like to come over sometime, maybe tonight?" Every morning after that, I woke up expecting some new honor to touch my life. But each day was about the same as the one before. Larry continued to play No Love 2 or 3 times a week, and always I would stop as if I were turned to stone and listen. For a quick few minutes, I would be lifted above the waiters, the diners, the hot kitchens, and the surly cooks. Then, just as quickly, after the song had ended, I was straining under their huge tray of dishes again. I led 2 lives, and there was no easy balance between them. The extremes left me frustrated and morose. Nevertheless, trouble was furthest from my mind as I waited for a streetcar one evening after work. It was late, so I decided to telephone Sally and tell her that I was on my way. Approaching the hotel drugstore, I noticed 3 men. They were white, passing out handbills and pamphlets, and as I neared them, I sensed trouble. And trouble came quickly. "Here, boy," one said, shoving a pamphlet into my hand. "Tell your mammy and your pappy to vote like this thing says." "Go to hell," I countered, and I threw the pamphlet to the ground. A sharp kick answered against my ribs, but I was prepared. Adjusting my ring, which was set with crystal, I doubled my fist and swung at the one nearest to me. He fell to the street, his face cut from his eye to his ear. The second one ducked my blow, but I caught the largest of the 3 with a hard right. He fell backward toward a plate glass window, and he grabbed me about the neck and pulled me with him. We both crashed through the window, but my neck, body, and arms caught most of the glass. His friends pulled him out, and they ran, forcing their way through a crowd of spectators who had gathered during the commotion. By the time I was carried into the drugstore, I was badly bleeding, and the second finger on my right hand hung half-severed from its joint. The drugstore employees covered my wounds with wet towels, and someone called the police. Eventually, the police took the 3 white men to jail, and I was imprisoned along with them as a material witness. Only bars separated us from one another. I asked for a doctor, but by 2 in the morning none had come, and I curled up on my cot and tried to sleep. Imprisoned there in the foul dark, I felt like a caged and injured animal. The other 3, having slept off their drunk, had begun to mutter obscenities. "We'll kill you the next time, you damn dirty nigger, you black bastard. Wait till we get you on the street again." I closed my eyes, still hoping that sleep might separate me from the experience. And in my despair, I forced my thoughts from their ugliness into my mother's grave. Then things were easier. The mere thought of her eased the tensions and the boiling inside me. "You sleep, tar baby?" I didn't answer. "Maybe the bastard's dead." "Hey, we pissed on your floor." The odor bore him out, but I lay still, my mind's eye deep inside the grave. The image of my mother, slim brown hands crossed, face sharp and immobile, demanding in its repose that I remember her teachings. My anger began to rise again, and suddenly, out of control, I got up. I lifted my cot and slammed it against the bars. The 3 barely stirred. Only a flat grunt came from one of them. They were asleep. In my rage, I had only hurt my finger, and it was beginning to bleed again. Some time later, the lights went on, and the policeman unlocked the cell. He shook the 3 men awake and told them they were free. "Well, what about me?" I asked as he started away. "You just take it easy, friend," he grumbled. "You've caused enough trouble for one night." "But my finger, it's half off and it's bleeding again," I protested. "Ain't no doctor around this time of morning." "Well, how about a hospital then?" "You just take it easy like I told you." He flipped the light switch, went out, and slammed the door shut. I lay back and tried to reason things out. Why, I wondered, were the police releasing them and holding me? Dawn finally broke, and when they released me several hours later, undoctored and unfed, it was raining. The same bloody towels were wrapped about my neck, arms, and hands. I stood in the doorway of the jail for several moments, gulping in the fresh air. Then I walked slowly in the downpour, letting the rain beat life back into my body. People huddling in the doorway observed me curiously, unaware of the bitterness inside me, where only a short time before there had been hope and joy. 10 new scars inflicted by white men ached beneath these towels, and my life, held now in a body of trouble and hurt, was ready to explode with hatred and revenge. After a doctor had dressed my wounds and stitched my finger into place, I holed up again in my room at Cora's. And as the cuts gradually closed, they seemed to seal in the experience, and the bitterness trapped inside me began poisoning all the senses that governed my thinking. When I returned to work 2 days later, Gleason said that Larry was anxious to see me. But by now I had lost all my grand illusions. I had been dreaming instead of facing the truth, I said to myself as I knocked on his door. But the orchestra leader's first words shocked me. "We close here Saturday night, and I'd like to take you along with the band," he said. Packing that same night, I tried thinking of a goodbye that would leave both Sally and me hopeful. We were on the verge of parting when the right way came to me. "I'm leaving with Larry's orchestra early tomorrow morning," I said firmly, "and I'm going to make enough money to come back and marry you." "Are you proposing?" she asked. "I think so. If I am, do you accept?" She answered with a kiss and a hug, and we took another walk. I was charged with hope when I boarded the bus the next morning. Things did look promising. I went to New York with Larry Duncan's band, but the band dissolved an hour after we got there, and I headed for Harlem on the subway, getting off at 145th Street. Coming up with the crowd, I turned to watch the trains pull away, then continued up the steps to the street. This was Harlem, and I was a part of it, of its people, its songs, and its words. Then I started roaming through the sea of black faces, and they were not as I had expected them to be. They seemed troubled and melancholy. And walking along, I found that, in spite of my color, I was a stranger here. This wasn't Kansas or Minnesota, where people with dark skins usually nodded to one another. It was like being cast upon an island with kinfolk who had suddenly become alien to you. I walked up St. Nicholas Avenue and saw a sign that said rooms. I thought it looked clean, so I went up the steps and knocked on the door and waited. "Who is it?" The guttural voice came from behind the door. In my very best Minnesota manner, I said that I was looking for a room. The door opened, and a fat, gray-haired woman looked out at me. She looked me up and down as if she were determining my ability to pay. "Where you from, boy, and what's your name?" I gave her my name and told her that I was from Minnesota. "Up north?" she questioned cautiously. "Yes, ma'am," I answered, wondering whether this worked for me or against me. When she mumbled that she only had a $5-a-week room left, I saw that she was toothless and chewed on her gums. I only had $7. My past experience told me that she would want a week in advance. "Well, you want it or not, son?" "Oh, yes, ma'am, I'll take it. That's just fine." She looked me up and down again before allowing me in. Then finally she said, "It's on the top floor, and you have to pay a week in advance. I don't like a lot of strange people coming in here all the time, and my name is Miss Haskins, and this is the house of the Lord." She took me to a room that was small, dirty, and held a strong odor like stale cabbage and iodine. There was a window, but one of the panes was broken, and a rag filled the opening. A linoleum, cracked from time and wear, covered parts of the floor, and the bed looked as if it had slept hundreds of bodies. The mattress was lumpy, stained, and torn, but Mrs. Haskins quickly covered it with a sheet, one that had been washed but not ironed. A wash basin sloped from one of the corners, and when I gave the spigot a full twist, only a rusty trickle of water came out, and it was cold. She took my $5, threw me an old blanket she took from a closet, and left. If at that moment someone had offered me a ride back to Fort Scott, Kansas, or St. Paul, Minnesota, I would have taken it. I unpacked and lay across the bed to rest for a moment, but hours had passed before I woke to a gnawing inside the wall near my head. It was dark, and I got to my knees, listening to the rat's teeth cutting the wood, trying to remember where I was. I smacked the wall with my fist. The gnawing stopped for a few moments, then it started again and kept up all night long. I finally went to sleep again, clutching a shoe, just in case he tunneled through the wall. Welts and spots covered my body when I awoke the next morning. Bed bugs had feasted on me. The sheet was spotted where I smashed them during the night. Nevertheless, I felt a lot better when the sunlight shone through the dirt on the window. The problem of hunting for a job hit me when I touched the street. The sun was higher now, the sky was clear, and far in the distance I could see the Manhattan skyscrapers rising from the tenements like rows of carved stone. I walked east on 145th Street to Lenox Avenue, and when I turned the corner there was a stand where one could get a hot dog and root beer for 7 cents. I ate 2 portions while checking the want ads. Someone needed a plumber's helper. The Park Central Hotel needed waiters and dishwashers, but they wanted white waiters and white dishwashers, and the plumber wanted a white helper. The ads all said so. Harlem was fully alive now, but a chill still hung in the air, and the stoops were filling with Negroes who stood warming in the sun. I walked slowly down the avenue observing them. They were gathered in groups, their eyes sullen against the morning light. Their mood seemed as ugly as their clothing, and they looked as if all promise had died inside them. I stopped at Mac's for another hot dog and root beer on the way home. A boy about my age was at the counter that night, and he said, "Good evening, brother," and he said it in a very friendly way. His face was an Indian brown, and he was stocky and of medium height. After watching me gulp down the hot dog, he smiled and said, "I hope you won't think I'm being too personal, But you seem awfully hungry." "You're right. I'm hungry and I'm broke," I answered. He looked around. Mac, his boss, was in the rear counting money. "Have a round on the house," he said, and he shoved me another helping. "I was as broke as you before I got this job last month." We shook hands, and he said his name was Bill Hunter. He worked nights and slept days, and I came by the stand several times that week and filled up. Bill was very intelligent, and he knew Harlem, and he told me more about the ghetto, as he called it, than I could have learned in months on my own. "The main thing is not to let it eat you up, brother," he said, after we discussed it. Each day there were long walks in search of work, as far down as 42nd Street sometimes, and I would return weary and desperate, my face and manner showing the strain of the fruitless journey. A long, skinny man with bulging eyes sat on the stoop one Saturday afternoon when I got back. He looked as though he belonged to the place, and when he spoke, I sat down beside him and we shook hands. His skin was damp and felt like leather. I gave my name, and he introduced himself as Charlie, saying that he lived up on the 3rd floor. I spent the next half hour telling Charlie how I got to New York and how badly I needed a job. He listened without interrupting. When we had finished talking, he got up and stretched. He was well over 6 feet tall, and the high-crowned hat he wore made him look even taller. He invited me upstairs to listen to his records, and he did have a stack of them, by Duke Ellington, Don Redman, Claude Hopkins, Chick Webb, Fats Waller, and Fletcher Henderson. Several times Mrs. Haskins hollered up to him, "Turn that thing off, Charlie!" But not until after she had banged on the floor and threatened to throw him out did Charlie soften the music. "I like my sound so loud that it's inside me and all around me," he said. I had gone to bed very late, but Charlie rapped on my door early the next morning and announced himself in a very sleepy voice. He still wore the big hat and the zoot suit and looked as if he had never gone to bed. "How'd you like to make a little bread this morning?" he asked me with a yawn. "Bread?" "Yeah, bread." "You mean money?" "Yeah, man, bread, loot, anything you want to call it." "How?" I asked, knowing that I only had 60 cents left. "Nothing to it. Come by my place after you get dressed." Well, now I was green, but I knew that Charlie was what my dad called bad blood, that he was real trouble. I remembered Abby's warning, "Just be careful up there in Harlem." But I threw it off with the first growl of hunger and started dressing. "What's the work you got for me?" His eyes were bloodshot. He closed them and rubbed the lids. Then he looked at me curiously, and in the morning light I noticed that his lips were scorched from the heat of too many reefers. Charlie motioned me into a chair. Then he stretched out on his bed, which was broken and too short for his body. He was a rather funny sight lying there, his pointed-toed yellowed shoes hanging over the bed's end. "Fact is, I'm mighty tired. Too much work. I need help." And he pointed to a neat pile of small newspaper-wrapped packages on the floor. "All you gotta do is deliver some of those for me every day and pick up some envelopes for me. It's just as simple as that, okay? You get $1 for every trip you make." It seemed mysterious, and Charlie made it more so by not telling me what was in the packages. I knew he wasn't peddling religious objects. I simply didn't ask questions. A few minutes later, on the 3rd floor of a building less than a block away, I knocked at door 3B. "What you want?" a voice growled from the other side. "I got a package for Shorty." My answer was in a tone that said I was hip, that I was in the know. The door opened up slightly, and a dark giant of a man looked out evilly at me. "You Shorty?" I asked haltingly. "That's right." He yanked the package from me, shoved a dirty sealed envelope into my hand, and slammed the door shut. The other package went to a man named Red who lived in the basement on 135th Street between 7th and 8th Avenues, a few doors down from the 135th Street police precinct. Red seemed to be waiting for me and opened up at my first knock. Red was black, small, and as hairless as a billiard ball. Probably I had made a mistake. "You Red?" "Yeah, what you want?" "I'm from Charlie." "You got the package?" "Are you sure you're Red?" "Yeah, man, give it here." He, too, handed me a soiled envelope. "Tell Charlie I'm a due sharp. I'll leave it on the next buy, okay?" "Okay," I said rather negatively, as though Charlie might not like his being a deuce sharp. What in the hell is going on, I wondered. Charlie turns out to be a giant, and red is as black as the ace of spades. It so happened that Charlie wasn't very happy about his being a deuce sharp. He already owes me $2 from the last buy, but he liked my speed and accuracy. There'll be 3 more this afternoon, he told me. By the end of the week, I had made over $30. My rent was paid, my stomach was full, and a little extra bread was stashed under my mattress for safekeeping. Things looked better. The following Friday, I bought a pair of shoes, not too unlike Charlie's, and made a down payment on a suit at London Taylor's, a 135th Street shop that specialized in the Harlem drape. I hadn't seen Bill in over 2 weeks. "I've been worried about you," he told me later in the evening. "Oh, I've been doing pretty good," I said, showing him the new shoes. "What you been working at?" "Oh, I've been helping a guy with some packages." "Packages? What kind of packages, brother?" Either Bill suspected something, or I was getting the least bit shaky about my new situation. Or maybe it was the way I said packages. In any case, he was quiet for about a half hour, waiting now and then on a customer. Finally he said, "Brother, you seem a little nervous about something. Is everything all right?" I was about to lie and say that everything was all right, but there was a sudden need to unburden myself on the secret, and feeling that Bill could be trusted, I told him exactly what I had been doing. His usual smile was replaced by surprise, then dismay. "Brother," he said, "that's fire, the worst kind. They'll throw the book at you, and your luck could run out tomorrow. Forget that you ever saw that guy." After Harlem, I went through many experiences, including life at a conservation corps camp, marriage to Sally Alvis, and work as a waiter on a railway train. You got to know many characters on the road. My favorite was Charlie Quigley. Charlie used to read a lot, and one day I thumbed through a magazine he had left behind. There was a portfolio of photographs in it that I couldn't forget. They were of migrant workers, dispossessed, beaten by dust, storms, and floods. They roamed the highways in caravans of battered jalopies and wagons between Oklahoma and California, scrounging for work. And across 2 pages was a memorable picture of a father and his 2 small sons running to their shanty in a dust storm. The names of the photographers that stuck in my mind were Arthur Rothstein, Russell Lee, Carl Maidans, Walker Evans, Ben Shahn, John Vashon, Jack Delano, Dorothea Lange. They all worked for the Farm Security Administration, a government agency set up by Roosevelt to aid submarginal farmers. These stark images of men, women, and children, caught in their confusion and poverty, saddened me. I asked Charlie to give me the magazine, and I took it home and kept looking at those photographs and the names of the photographers for months. And for some reason I could not yet explain, I was becoming restless again. The railway or the money I made there wasn't enough anymore. The extraordinary thing was perhaps coming closer. Ida Alvis, with that remarkable inquisitiveness mothers-in-law have, sensed this restiveness. She concluded that it was threatening her daughter's security, and trouble struck our little family full and hard. "Mom thinks you ought to stay home, off the road. Mom thinks I ought to get some new clothes. Mom thinks you're buying too many books. Your mom is thinking too much for me nowadays. I think she'd better keep her nose out of my business. And I think you'd better stop listening to what she thinks." We had the first big argument of our marriage, and it cut a distance between us that grew wider each day. Then I tried to mend the breach by buying her a coat that I couldn't afford. It was a pretty impractical one of black velvet trimmed with marten. When she tried it on, all the sales ladies fluttered around telling me how beautiful she looked, and I, bursting with pride and stuffed with flattery, pulled out $100, all the money I had saved since our marriage. With a forced calm, I paid for it while Sally preened before the mirror. She didn't really need the coat, and Joe, her father, condemned me roundly for wasting my money on what he called a rag with skunk hair. I didn't mind. It was an expensive but honest attempt to rekindle the love I knew we had for each other. Joe, in his crude way, was only complaining that I had gone about it in the wrong way. Well, he was right, but Sally liked it, and that was important to me. There were different ways to kill time during our stopovers in Chicago. The older waiters usually slept, and the younger ones went out on the town. They tried coaxing me out with them, but I was too weighted with the unhappiness that lay over Sally and me. One night I did go out to a bar, but then I drank too much and came back in even lower spirits. I killed time at the movies, or during the summer months, I bought picture magazines and read them as I walked along the lake shore. One morning in December 1937, I wandered into the Chicago Art Institute on Michigan Avenue. I had no intention of staying long, but awed suddenly by the beautiful paintings, I spent several hours in this large and voiceless place. My reaction to the paintings was much the same as that I had toward the Farm Security Administration photographs nearly 5 months before, and by now I was convinced of the power of a good picture, and I decided to visit the Institute whenever I came to Chicago. That same afternoon I went to a movie, and during a newsreel, I saw Japanese warplanes bomb the USS Panay. The photographer had stayed at his post, shooting the final belch of steam and smoke that rose when the ill-fated gunboat sank into the Yangtze River. The newspapers and radio reported the bombing, but the newsreel, through its grim directness, brought me face to face with the real horror of war. It's the same thing the Farm Security Administration photographers did with poverty, I thought as I sat watching. When the newsreel ended, a voice boomed over the theater intercom system. "And here he is, Norman Alley, the photographer who shot this remarkable film." Alley stepped out on the stage with a white suit amid the cheers of the audience. He bowed, and after it was quiet, he talked about his experience. I was enthralled. He had no way of knowing it, but he had just changed my life. I sat through another show, and even before I left the theater, I had made up my mind I was going to become a photographer. The first thing I did when we reached Seattle was to go camera hunting, but the high prices of the good cameras came as a shock, and for a while I walked the streets with $17 in my pockets, wondering how to raise more money quickly. I remembered what I had spent for Sally's coat and began to regret it. With that $100 and a little more, I could have bought a very professional-looking German camera one dealer showed me. But I had made up my mind to get a camera before leaving Seattle, and this determination brought me to Abe Cohen's pawn shop on a side street in the downtown area. There were probably better cameras in his shop, but only one had the professional look which suited my taste, a Voigtlander Brilliant. I liked that name, and when he told me it was only $12.50, I hurriedly pulled the money from my pocket. "I'll take it," I said, without bothering to inspect the camera. "You want film?" the pawnbroker asked. Well, I hadn't thought of this, but I answered almost indignantly, "Why, of course. Give me 3 rolls." "What kind?" Well, the best you've got." That was the only answer I could give him. The pawnbroker smiled. Certainly he knew that I didn't even know how to load it. Well, neither did he, for that matter, and we spent a half hour figuring out how the camera worked. He wished me good luck when I went out the door, and I walked on toward the waterfront, shooting buildings, people, signs, and anything else that interested me. I was confident that those first pictures would be masterpieces. It turned out to be a remarkable start. I went down to the wharves and fell headfirst into the Puget Sound trying to shoot pictures of seagulls. Luckily, some firemen were nearby, and I hung on to my camera, splashing about, hollering for help until they fished me out with a long pole. But I lost no time in getting back to my new profession. Dripping wet and shivering, I hurried to the dining car, dried out my camera, then changed into a clean shirt and my waiter's uniform. Later that day, I went back to the pawn shop and bought 2 more rolls of film and a handbook on exposure, and I shot pictures until the sun went down. From that night on, after the other waiters had gone to bed, I sat up in the empty dining car studying my camera and any magazine or paper that had a good photograph on its pages. Eastman Kodak developed the first roll of film. Surprisingly, it had survived its bath in Puget Sound. And when I went for prints, one of the clerks complimented me on my first efforts. "Keep it up, and we'll give you a show," he said. I didn't take him seriously, and he realized it. "I mean it," he said. "You've got a good eye." "Are you kidding?" "Nope, I'm not. I showed them to the manager this morning. He liked them, too." Still cautious, I thanked him, saying that I would hold him to his word. He kept it, and 6 weeks later, Eastman gave me an exhibit in the window of their downtown Minneapolis store. Perhaps I would have become the best waiter photographer on the North Coast Limited, had it not been for a Southern steward named Barnes. He gave Negro college boys and young uppity Negras who read books and studied a hard time. Many of them bumped themselves when they found out he was to be their steward. But I was blossoming in confidence when he took over our crew in the winter of 1938. "I'll read at night if I have to sit up in the locomotive," I told one of the waiters who warned me against him. Yet, I got an uneasy feeling the first night out when he switched off the lights while I sat in the empty dining car reading. "Beg your pardon," I said. "Would you turn those lights back on? I'm reading." He gave me a sour look. "You studying to be the first Negro president of the United States?" Then he went off to bed, and I got up, turned on the lights, and continued to read. But from then on, nothing I did was right. Barnes wrote my orders out wrong, then blamed me if a passenger complained. He piled extra work on me. I mopped the hallways. I polished silverware that didn't need polishing. Cleaned and recleaned the pantry. If he thought that fatigue would stop my late reading, he was wrong. I called on every ounce of strength and patience to take the work and his goading. Each night after he switched off the lights, I got up and turned them on again. He finally provoked me into violence a few hours before we arrived in St. Paul one evening. During dinner, he intentionally pushed my arm, and I spilled 4 bowls of hot soup on a passenger and myself. My skin burning and the passenger cursing me, I forgot that it was winter, that I had a family, and that I needed a job. I shoved Barnes into the pantry, snatched up a bread knife, and held it against his throat. 2 waiters rushed in and grabbed me. Barnes never uttered a word. He stood there shaking, then backed out of the pantry and into the dining car. And ashamed to face the passengers again, I went up to the bunk car, changed my clothes, and lay across my bed until we reached St. Paul. On October the 3rd, I was called into the commissary for a hearing. Mr. Barnes was there, and so was the entire crew who had witnessed the trouble. Thompson, the superintendent, knew Barnes and his hatreds, but he contended that it was I who was on trial, not Barnes. And after the hearing, where only one waiter, Bill Williams, condemned the steward's actions, Thompson said icily, "You're fired." My wife and I got a divorce. She and my son went back to live with their parents, and I moved to St. Paul and stayed with my sister Cora. But I never stopped taking photographs, even though the pleasure I derived from it did not compensate for my loneliness. The thought of being away from my child, or the possibility of his someday having another father, burned me. And now that I had found what I considered to be my future, I blamed it for having robbed me of the 2 people I loved most. Each day I went out to hunt for a job, but I failed to find anything. And this bothered me, because it meant that I had nothing to send toward my son's support. It came about in a most natural way. Sally came to a party with a new boyfriend from Chicago, and I escorted a beautiful girl to the same party. Her name was Henrietta Bonaparte, and she had large, soulful eyes and honey-colored skin, and she was a poem in her crimson velvet gown. Sally took one look and immediately lost both of her earrings. She was nearly in tears over those earrings when she come to ask me for help. Loyal to her sex, Henrietta suggested that I go help her. We were very lucky. They had accidentally fallen into Sally's party bag. And she thanked me, and we danced several times, and she said that Butch missed me, and I said that I missed him, and that I would come over that weekend, and she said that would be fine. And I went over, and we went for a ride in the moonlight. And the next week, we got married again. We moved considerably farther from her family's place this time. Our apartment was small, comfortable, and furnished on credit. Butch was almost 5 now, and in the spring the three of us began with the picnics, lake rides, and visits to the parks again. For some time I had been making a photographic collection of attractive girls, and Cecil Newman, the editor of the Minneapolis Spokesman and Recorder, began running them on the front page of his paper every week. There was no pay. I accepted the space for the pleasure of seeing my work published. It was good to see my name in bold type beneath the featured beauty each week. But I wasn't making money. So I told Cecil some sort of financial arrangement had to be made if we were to continue. His paper was in more financial trouble than I, but the two of us out-talked his wife, who resisted to the end, and raided her treasury for more money to buy a press camera. Then Cecil appointed me official staff photographer and circulation manager. My pay was a certain percentage of whatever amount of a new circulation I could manage to get. Unfortunately, I was a better photographer than circulation manager. So I tried to increase distribution by ignobly hinting to mothers that their lovely daughters might be photographed and put on the front page if they bought a subscription. By September, my commissions had become far less praiseworthy than my title. Winter, my bitter enemy, was coming, and so was another child, my wife informed me. So I began looking for a title that would have less prestige and more money attached to it. I had already made matters worse by going into debt for new photographic equipment to Harvey Goldstein, the dealer from whom we had bought the press camera. He had a blind faith in me, although he had no reason for such trust. I hadn't paid him a cent all summer. But he gave me everything I asked for, including plenty of helpful advice. I was handed my new title on the 23rd of September. It was not to be compared with the one Cecil had bestowed upon me. In fact, I loathed it so much, I refused to admit its existence. When the Chicago Northwestern Railway hired me on a bar car as a porter, I decided then and there that I was an assistant bartender, not a porter. It had more dignity, and it sounded much better, I thought. I was not altogether a liar. I did serve drinks after the bartender had made them, but my specific duty was that of a porter, a title which I preferred not to mention again. But most importantly, I had a regular salary and a source for tips. One day, I saw the word "Life" in big red letters on a passenger's camera bag and discovered he was Bernard Hoffman, a photographer from that publication. We talked for a long time. "Come and work with us someday," he said when he got off in Chicago. And I laughed and promised that I would surely do that. Then a few weeks later, Bob Capa, the famous war photographer, came aboard, hoping to sleep the 400 miles back to Chicago, only to be kept awake with my constant barrage of questions. The contact with these men transformed me into a dynamo. I went to every large department store in the Twin Cities asking for a chance to photograph their merchandise. Frank Murphy had all but walked me out of the door when his wife, a handsome woman with a shock of black hair, spoke to her husband. "Well, what does he want, Frank?" He gestured hopelessly. "He wants to photograph fashions." "Well, maybe he can." Frank Murphy looked back at his wife as though she had lost her wits. "Have you any samples of your work to show me?" she asked. "No, I'm sorry." "Why do you want to photograph fashion?" Because I know I can, that's all. Well, our clothes are photographed out east. My spirit sank. But I'm willing to give you a chance. I think it would be fun. She thought for a moment. Can you be back here tomorrow evening right after we close? I'll have the models and dresses all ready. The ease and quickness of her decision stunned me. I hurried to Harvey Goldstein and told him about my assignment, and he became as jittery as I, rushing about finding the necessary lamps, bulbs, films, and camera. We were both exhausted late that night after he had assembled the equipment and showed me how to use it. The dresses and models were beautiful, and Mrs. Murphy seemed just as excited as I was about the whole thing. She went around buttoning the girls into the lovely evening dresses she had selected, and Frank Murphy stood by, watching us with a quizzical and skeptical eye. The models had more enthusiasm than talent, but they too were helpful and held the long, tiring poses I demanded of them. My lighting, inspired by the pictures I had so often studied in the pages of Vogue, wasn't at all bad. The biggest problem came when the models appeared on the ground glass upside down. Harvey hadn't warned me about this, and I went through the 4-hour sitting with the awful feeling that there was something cockeyed about the lens or the camera. But I bluffed it through without anyone being aware of my nervousness. My wife was asleep when she heard the moaning and my head bumping against the kitchen wall. "Well, what's the trouble?" she asked through the door. "My life is ruined. Your life is ruined. The whole damn world is ruined," I screamed. She stood, her hair up in curlers, bulky with our new child, looking at me in pity. "Well, what's the trouble?" I sat down dejectedly. "I've double exposed every damn picture but one. After all that work. All that work. I can't face that woman tomorrow. I just can't face her." We were silent for what seemed like an age, sitting there in the dim light of the kitchen. I had been given my big chance, and I had muffed it. Damn it. Damn it, I kept groaning. Why the hell did this have to happen to me? "Well, I'd blow up the good one and show it to her," my wife suggested as she went off to bed. I sat for an hour before her suggestion sank in. Then I made a huge enlargement of the only good negative. It was elegantly framed and standing on an easel at the entrance to the country club when Mrs. Murphy arrived with the models the next afternoon. "My dear boy," she exclaimed, "it's absolutely beautiful. Where are the others? I just can't wait to see them." "A woman like this deserves the truth, no matter what," I said to myself sadly. So I told the truth. "Forget it," she said cheerfully. "We've more work to do," but she warned, "no more of those nasty double exposures." The next week, my photographs were shown throughout her store in all the front windows, and I must have walked up and down the street 100 times that first night, feeling good every time someone stopped to look at one of them. An accidental meeting one day in Chicago with David Ross, a curator at the Southside Art Center, led to my abrupt departure from the Twin Cities that fall. Our friendship was almost instantaneous. I thought he had some awfully big ideas about things, but then he probably thought the same thing about me. "Damn," he said, "we've been yakking all night, and I've just realized that we can do each other some good. We got a fully equipped darkroom at the center with nobody in it. We need a photographer, and you need a place to work. We couldn't pay anything, but you wouldn't have to pay rent. We'd want you to photograph our activities now and then, or an exhibit, or things like that, and you could use one of the big rooms for your studio. How does that sound?" "Sounds great." "Then it's a deal. Just let me know when you're coming, and I'll start looking for an apartment for you." We pumped each other's hands happily and parted again. That night, I lay awake until nearly dawn, trying to make the final decision. And 2 days later, I gave the Chicago Northwestern notice. And leaving the 400, which was the name of my train, on September the 30th, I swore never to ride it again except as a passenger. There were a number of talented young people who worked at Chicago's Southside Art Center during those days, and one of the most promising was Charles White, a painter. Charlie was mild-appearing and blessed with humor, but his powerful black figures pointed at the kind of photography that I knew I should be doing myself. We became close friends as the days went by. We had great hopes, Charlie and I, and we spent hours talking to each other about those hopes. "I've tried to get a damn Julius Rosenwald fellowship a couple of times," he complained sadly one day, "but those granny dodgers just won't give me one." "What's a Julius Rosenwald fellowship?" I asked. "It's a fund set up for exceptionally able spooks and white crackers," he explained. "You ought to try for one next year." "Has a photographer ever gotten one?" "Not that I know of. Fact is, I know they haven't. But that's all the more reason you should try." "Hell, man," Charlie said, "let's me and you get one of those 142. What say?" "I'm with you, buddy," I agreed, and we laughed and shook hands on it. The Saturday morning I started poking on the south side with my camera, I knew that more than anything else I wanted to strike at the evil of poverty. And here it was, under my feet, all around and above me. I could point the camera in any direction and record it. My own brush with it was motive enough, yet this landscape of ash piles, garbage heaps, tired tenements, and littered streets was worse than any I had ever seen. Everything looked wrecked and bombed out. This is what I would photograph and submit for the Rosenwald Fellowship. I hardly knew where to begin, so I walked along, pacing off this area where life and building alike had fallen into grave disrepair. Then I came to a vacant lot where a large black man stood with a shovel in his hand and a woman and 2 children at his side. They were silent, looking as if they were at a graveside. A little girl, holding on to her mother's dress, was crying. I lifted my camera and shot the strange scene, and as they made their way toward a tenement house, I followed them. In passing the fresh grave, I saw a board stuck into the ashy earth. There was a crude crayon drawing of a dog on it. Beneath the drawing, printed also with crayon and in a child's hand, were the words "Bucky, our friend." I was photographing this pathetic eulogy when the man looked back at me. "What are you doing there, fella?" he asked. Would the kids like a picture of the grave?" They all looked at me strangely. "Yes, Papa," the weeping girl said. "Well, what you charging for it?" the father asked. "Oh, nothing at all. I'd just like for them to have it if they want it." "Well, how do we get it?" He seemed suspicious of me. "Well, just give me your address and name, and I'll send it to you. Have you got a pencil and paper?" "In the house. We got one in the house," the child said eagerly. "Come on," the father said. I followed them over the lot to their building. We passed a sign on a large brick wall. "First Class Undertaking, Home of Jenkins Funeral System Association. Don't let death embarrass your loved ones. Join today. Premiums as low as 10 cents per week." I climbed a rickety stairway behind them to the 3rd-floor room. The man invited me in, and after sizing me up properly, he asked me to sit down. The chair he offered was held together with baling wire. His wife sat on a stool, and he stood up. When I told him what I was trying to do with my camera, he pointed at his miserable quarters. "Well, you won't find much worse than this. Go ahead, take all the pictures you want. Just don't try to sell us none, 'cause we're busted." I started slowly, shooting first the one mattress where all of them slept on the floor. There was a small round table covered with a cracked oilcloth, and a greasy edition of Cinderella lay there on it, next to a stack of unwashed dishes. A framed picture of Christ and a Bible. There was a gas burner and a wash tub with a chunk of ice in it, which served as their refrigerator, and there was a sink propped up with 2 broom handles. All the clothes the family owned hung above their heads on a rope that stretched across the room. Overalls, gingham dresses, socks, and underwear. Most of the plaster had fallen from the walls, and the rotting laths showed through. "This here is what they call a one-room kitchenette," the father went on. "Only about 8 white families lived in this whole building once. When they cut out, the landlords chopped it up in the kind of holes you see I'm living in here. Now there's more than 8 families on the one floor alone." I broke in to ask him how much rent he paid. $7 a week when I can scrape it up. I got laid off from the slaughterhouse about 6 months ago. I get an odd job now and then. Most of the time I don't get nothing. I nodded, and he went on. See that baseball bat over there in the corner? Well, my boy there don't play ball with it. We kill rats with it. There's 3 times more rats in here than there is Negroes. Got so my wife and me have to sleep in shifts to keep 'em from gnawing up the kids. You lived here in Chicago all your life? I asked, having nothing else to say. No, I faded in here from Georgia about 8 years ago. Met my wife and started raising these kids about 3 years later. I looked at the children. They sat wide-eyed on the mattress. The girl held her 3-year-old brother's hand tightly. They watched their father as he talked. They're growing children, good ones, but what's living like this going to do to them down the line? Having seen some of the restless, beaten black boys and girls on the corners and in the taverns and pool rooms, I knew. Already, he rambled on, we've got to watch that something bad don't happen to our little girl here in these dark hallways. It's a shame, ain't it? Yes, sir, it's a shame, he said, answering his own question. This was only the beginning of a weekend after weekend of tramping through the dismal acres of the South Side, photographing depressed black people in the shacks and the brick tenements that entombed them. I got to know number runners and their hangouts. I sneaked pictures of men and boys gambling in the hallways. I saw 2 young black boys dying from each other's knife wounds on 47th and South Park one afternoon. I watched a Negro cop, known as Two Gun Pete, beat a Negro youth senseless with the butt of his pistol one night, just because he didn't move off the corner fast enough. Religion is all we got left, an old missionary woman told me one day. I had asked her to pose for me, and she stood, a little white bonnet perched on the top of her head, a Bible under her arm, looking into my camera. The lenses of her steel-rimmed glasses were like mirrors. Focusing sharply on them, I caught a reflection of the desolation that surrounded us. Being proud of that particular picture, I showed it to a society matron whom I photographed in her North Side penthouse the next afternoon. She held up the picture in her jeweled white hands and observed it carefully. A darling old lady, she purred. An awful lot like the mammy we had as children. And in the same breath, oh, I do want so much for you to make me beautiful. She shrieked with delight when I took her the finished photographs that Friday. And with the handsome fee she paid me, I bought more film to expose in that frightful ghetto once again. The Art Center promised me a show in the early fall of 1941. This, Peter Pollock, the director, and David Ross, his assistant, thought would give the Rosenwald people a chance to see my work at its very best. Fall came quicker than usual, it seemed, but by working day and night, I was able to meet the deadline. David hung the show, and we spent the final hours changing or readjusting the order of the pictures for what he called impact. Finally, one morning, an envelope came from the Rosenwald Fund. I was still in bed when Sally brought it to me. I lay there for a few seconds, afraid to open it. Here, I said, handing it back to her. Give me the bad news. She fumbled with the envelope for a long moment. Then, beginning at last to read, her anxious face softened. Then she said weakly, You made it. I wondered about Charlie White, afraid he might not have been so fortunate. I didn't know it then, but he was thinking the same way about me. The two of us were cautiously reserved when I finally got him on the phone. Charlie? Gordon? His voice couldn't hide the joy, and neither could mine. We made it! We made it! We both shouted at the top of our voices. As Rosenwald fellows, we would each get $200 a month for a year. Later that day, Billy Haygood, the assistant director of the fund, came by and warmly congratulated me. I had no difficulty answering him when he asked me where I would like to further my education as a photographer. The Farm Security Administration, I said, very confidently. Well, we've already written Roy Stryker, asking him to take you on as a trainee, he said, smiling. You'd better start getting packed. We think we know what his answer will be. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday in December, we were having some friends in to celebrate Butch's birthday and our happy prospects. Our cheer was underscored by Duke Ellington's music, which was being broadcast from a local station. Then the announcer's voice cut in. We have just received word that the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. That is all for the moment. Stay tuned to this station for the further news. It was December 7th, 1941. The news stunned us into silence. It seemed unbelievable. But then the confirming details began to come through. After our guest had departed, I stayed up all night listening to reports, trying to decipher their meaning. A great distance lay between the Kansas cornfields and that fellowship. The thing I had worked so hard for was so close, and now it seemed that those years of effort might be swept away. But the following week, an announcement by the President temporarily deferred married men with children, and shortly after, Roy Stryker wrote saying that he expected me in Washington, D.C. by January the 1st. At last, I was on the move. I came to Washington excited and eager on a clear, cold day in January. I had been singled out for an unusual blessing. I felt a notch above normal things, bursting with a new strength that would be unleashed upon this historic place. Using my camera effectively against intolerance was not so easy as I had assumed it would be. One evening, when Stryker and I were in the office alone, I confessed this to him. Well, at least you have learned the most important lesson, he said. He thought for a moment, got up and looked down the corridor, then called me to his side. There was a Negro charwoman mopping the floor. Go have a talk with her before you go home this evening. See what she has to say about life and things. You might find her interesting. This was a strange suggestion, but after he had gone, I went through the empty building searching for her. I found her in a notary public's office and introduced myself. She was a tall, spindly woman with sharp features. Her hair was swept back from graying temples, and a sharp intelligence shone in the eyes behind the steel-rimmed glasses. We started off awkwardly, neither of us knowing my reasons for starting the conversation. At first, it was a meaningless exchange of words. Then, as if a dam had broken within her, she began to spill out her life story. It was a pitiful one. She had struggled alone after her mother had died and her father had been killed by a lynch mob. She had gone through high school, married, and become pregnant. Her husband was accidentally shot to death 2 days before the daughter was born. By the time the daughter was 18, she had given birth to 2 illegitimate children, dying 2 weeks after the second child's birth. What's more, the first child had been stricken with a paralysis a year before its mother died. Now, this woman was bringing up these grandchildren on a salary hardly suitable for one person. Well, who takes care of them while you're at work? I asked after a long silence. Oh, different neighbors, she said, her heavily veined hands tightening about the mop handle. Can I photograph you? Oh, I don't mind, she said. My first photograph of her was unsubtle. I overdid it and posed her, Grant Wood style, before the American flag, a broom in one hand, a mop in the other, staring straight into the camera. Stryker took one look at it the next day and fell speechless. Well, how do you like it? I asked eagerly. He just smiled and shook his head. Well, keep working with her. Let's see what happens, he finally replied. I followed her for nearly a month, into her home, her church, and wherever she went. You're learning, Stryker admitted when I laid the photographs out before him one evening. You're showing you can involve yourself in other people. This woman has done you a great service. I hope you understand this. I did understand. By now, John Vachon, one of the staff photographers, and I had become fast friends. John didn't talk much. and you got the feeling that he censored each thought before letting it go. But under his calm lay a dry, biting sense of humor. He was lean and long-jawed, and when his sandy hair was uncut, he looked like a Texas Wrangler. Since there were so few places we could go together, our families visited each other's homes. One day he came in angry and disheveled, his face dead white. "What's the matter, John?" I asked. But he just kept on walking without reply. Weeks later, he told me a white bus driver had cursed and pushed a colored woman, and John had fought with him. Later that same year, Marjorie Collins, a young photographer, joined the staff. And since the three of us were about the same age, our friendship spread to her, and we went about the city under stares from some of Washington's white citizens. We were upsetting the established order of things, we knew, but we would not sacrifice our friendship to it. More and more now, the Farm Security Administration was feeling the strong opposition of Southern conservatives. And Stryker, sensing at last the futility of the fight, warned us that the end might be near. I saw very little of him during those frantic days. He bounced in and out of the office with officials and politicians who had joined him in his last-ditch fight. Only once did we talk to each other, and that concerned the complaints that were coming in about Marjorie, John, and me for being seen so much together. That conversation was halted by an important telephone call Stryker received. "We'll talk about it later," he said. I walked angrily from his office. How dare he even question our friendship? The blow finally came. The Farm Security Administration was to be abolished, but some of us would be absorbed into the Office of War Information, an agency set up in 1942 under Elmer Davis to consolidate domestic and foreign information activities of the government. My situation was depressing, and I felt defeated. I wasn't on the government payroll, and my Rosenwald grant would expire the 1st of January. I didn't feel I had achieved as much as I'd hoped to during the year. I had suffered an estrangement from Stryker, and I considered myself to be ignored and only tolerated by him. I couldn't stay in Washington, and the thought of going back to Chicago tormented me. Meanwhile, Stryker painfully whittled away at his staff. He sent for me late one Friday afternoon. "Well, by now you know that we've been absorbed by OWI." I wanted to say, "Get it over with, Roy. It's okay. Don't make a long message of it." He went on. "We haven't lost everything. There's a still out here to fight for, the picture file, records, and the jobs as many employees as I can save. I'm sure you understand the importance of all this, don't you?" "I do," I said honestly. "Well, no individual is more important than all this. This place must somehow go on. No one, two, or three persons can place it in jeopardy. You might as well face the fact that this is a Southern city with Southern feelings, and there's only so much you can do about it. Now, I have no personal feelings about your and Marjorie's friendship. It is as natural as day, and I am happy to see it. But there are a lot of people around here who don't feel the same as I do, and they feed the flames. Frankly, I want to take you with us, but you can't if I continue my friendship with Marjorie Collins. Is that it, Roy?" I would save him his job. I'd cut my own throat for him quickly. "You spent all this time teaching me not to knuckle under to prejudice," I said. "I'm not about to do it now, even if it means I won't be going to the Office of War Information with you." I said it almost without knowing that I was saying it, but it felt right, and I was ready to leave. A smile suddenly played at the corners of his mouth. "Well," he answered finally, "you're hired." America was in its second year of war, and now that I was a part of the information agency, I got an impulsive urge for an overseas assignment. My chief concern had become the Negro soldiers' participation. The 99th Pursuit Squadron, made up of Negroes, was already overseas, and now the initial Negro fighter group, the 332nd, under Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., was being readied at Selfridge Field in Michigan. This seemed the logical outfit to join, to show it in training and later in action, and with Stryker's help I applied for my credentials. I would spend the rest of the training period with the pilots of the 332nd, then accompany them to the overseas base. After a few months, I would join a bomber group, and from inside these B-17s and B-24s, I would photograph the Negro pilots as they escorted us to and from the targets. A little after mid-December, an order came from the Pentagon halting all furloughs. We knew what this meant. Any day now we would be going overseas. A new tempo hit the base. The men rushed about, patting one another's backs, awaiting moving orders. They came one morning about a week before Christmas. That afternoon, Colonel Davis called me to headquarters. "We're about to pull out," he said, "and your traveling papers are not in order." "Well, what's wrong with them?" I asked. "You'll have to take that up with Washington. I advise you to fly there. We'll probably be leaving before they can get word back here to you." I packed the battle gear that had been issued to me that morning, took a bus to Detroit, then a plane to Washington. The first thing Monday morning, I went to see Ted Poston, a friend of mine in the Office of War Information Press Section. He, too, had heard the rumors, and Ted put things in the true perspective. There's some Southern gentlemen and a conservative Republican on Capitol Hill who don't like the idea of giving this kind of publicity to Negro soldiers. I was shocked, and so was Ted, but there wasn't much we could do about it. The next day, I reached Elmer Davis by telephone and told him my story. He listened attentively. When I finished, he said, "Well, don't worry, Gordon. I'll be in touch with the Pentagon this afternoon. We report there tomorrow. I'm sure everything will be all right." That night, on the Howard University campus, I met Captain Lee Rayford and Lieutenant Walter Lawson, two pilots from the 99th Pursuit Squadron. They had returned to the States after completing their required number of missions. Captain Rayford was the holder of the Purple Heart, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, and the Yugoslav Red Star. He had been shot up over Austria by a Messerschmitt 109. Both of them could have remained stateside as instructors. Instead, they have volunteered to go back to the war zone. We ate dinner together, and since they had to go to the Pentagon the next day, we agreed to meet and go together. We had no sooner boarded the bus and seated ourselves behind the driver than his voice came at us, metallic and demanding. "If you fellows want to ride to Virginia, you got to go to the rear." We looked at each other questioningly, deciding in our silence not to move. The driver stood up and faced us, a scrawny, disheveled man with tobacco-stained teeth and a hawk nose. The armpits of his uniform were discolored with sweat. "You all heard what I said. This bus ain't going nowhere till you all go back to where you belong." "We intend going to Virginia in the seats we're in," Lee said with a finality. "Okay. If you ain't back there in 1 minute, I'm calling the MPs and having you put off." "You better start calling right now," Lee replied. Two white Air Force captains and a major were seated across the aisle from us, and I noticed that they stirred uncomfortably. Several other whites were scattered in the near-empty bus, and an elderly Negro lady sat at the rear. I watched her through the rear-view mirror. She had half risen from her seat. There was courage, dignity, and anger in every line of her small body. Her look demanded that we stay there, and I was determined not to disappoint her. The bus had become dead quiet while the driver stood glowering at us. "Fellas," one of the young white captains was speaking now, "we know how you feel about this," he said, "but the major has an appointment at the Pentagon in a half hour. He wonders if you would mind moving back so we can be on our way." Now, my two friends were outranked, but there were no bars on my shoulders. The American eagle on my officer's cap was as large and significant as his or the major's. I took a good look at the old woman in the rear. She was standing now, gripping the seat ahead of her. Then, borrowing the captain's icy politeness, I stood and addressed the major. "Sir," I said, "as you can see, these men are fighter pilots. They have completed their missions, but they have volunteered for more duty at the front. Would you like to order your fellow officers to the rear? They have no intention of moving otherwise. My anger was rising, so I sat back down. The bus driver stood watching us until the major finally spoke to him. "Drive on," he said. "Can't you tell when you're licked?" The driver cursed under his breath, threw himself into the seat and slammed in the gears, and we lurched off toward Virginia. "Hallelujah!" the Negro woman shouted from the rear. "Hallelujah!" Her voice rang with pathos and triumph. "Thank God we don't have to sit in the back of our P-38s," Lawson sighed as we got off the bus. Colonel Davis sent for me just before noon, and I hurried very anxiously to his office. No more trouble, I hoped. It was too close to sailing time. "I'm sorry. Your papers are not in order. A final call from the Pentagon has come through. You will not be able to embark with us." "This is ridiculous," I said. "Can't you do anything? Someone in Washington is trying to prevent coverage of your group overseas, Colonel. This is the first Negro fighter group. It's history. It has to be covered. Can't you protest in some way, Colonel?" "There's nothing, absolutely nothing I can do. The orders are from the Pentagon. They cannot be rescinded. I'm terribly sorry." I thought back to the fighter pilots. They would soon be far out to sea, sailing toward war and death, ignoring, at least temporarily, their differences with the land they were leaving to defend. This was the price for a questionable equality. I strode into the Washington, D.C. air terminal, tired, hungry, and irritated to a point of fury. My nerves were stretched raw. Everyone in the place looked as if he were a member of the Ku Klux Klan. My whole body seemed to be itching for a fight, a last physical protest against the frustrations of these last 6 days. I walked toward the lunch counter, where only one seat remained unoccupied. The man next to it had a red creased neck, thin lips. His beady eyes, manner, and clothing spoke of the Deep South. I detested the very sight of him. I knew he would say the words that would set me upon him. I threw my gear on the floor, clenched my fist, and sat down beside him, waiting. And he was turning now, looking me over. My body tensed. And then he said, easily, casually, "Good morning, soldier. Looks like it's going to be a nice day for flying." He pulled out a pack of cigarettes and offered me one. Then he lit it. With some difficulty, I came to terms with myself. Then I blew out the smoke and confusion in one long breath. "Well, you're right. Looks like a good day for flying," I said. "A very good day." And the two of us ate in peace. I didn't ask him where he was from or where he was going. It didn't make any difference. It was a nice day for flying. And I said this to the stewardess when I boarded the plane for New York. And I said this to the old lady who sat beside me in the plane. And I said this to the skycap who helped me with my bags at LaGuardia Field, and to the cabbie who drove me up to Harlem. A friendly word from a stranger and a cigarette had lifted me temporarily from the darkness. As I settled back into the cab, I linked him in my mind with the old trolley conductor who had befriended me on that cold and lonely morning 20 years before, moments after I had thought of robbing him. With a few kind words, these two men, like all the others who had helped me, had pushed me a few more inches down the road. Harvey Goldstein, for instance, had given me more than I expected, more probably than he could afford. Roy Stryker, with patience and foresight, had given me discipline and a sense of direction. I could, in a way, even be thankful to my brother-in-law and to Barnes, the dining car steward. Their actions had also propelled me to the point at which I now found myself. It was sad to think that somewhere they still wallowed in unhappiness. My experience had left me scarred and angry at times, but now I was bringing back my hopes to the shadowy ghetto. to see if they would take root in the asphalt of the city streets, would sprout in the smoke and soot, grow in barren days and nights, and at last know fruition. If so, the hunger, hardship, and disillusion would have served me well. My mother had freed me from the curse of inferiority long before she died by not allowing me to take refuge in the excuse that I had been born black. She had given me ambition and purpose, and set the course I had since traveled. As we reached the high point of the bridge, a stretch of dreary rooftops widened on the horizon. I didn't know what lay ahead of me, but I believed in myself. My deepest instincts told me I would not perish. Poverty and bigotry would still be around, but at last I could fight them on even terms. The significant thing was a choice of weapons with which to fight them most effectively. That I would accept those of a mother who placed love, dignity, and hard work over hatred was the fate that had accompanied me from her womb. We left the bridge and rolled into Harlem, and I was among the tired tenements and garbage cans again. They didn't seem strange to me now. When we crossed Lenox Avenue, an icy wind was swirling trash up from the gutters. The hawk was over the ghetto, and all around me, black people were buttoned up and hurrying against its fury.